Right. So everyone, welcome to yet another OpenChain community call. We're having quite a special one today in that we're doing a deep dive into capability maturity modeling. Now, Andrew, the chair of the education work group, will be explaining this in more detail, of course, but the bird's eye overview is that more and more open source management is becoming professional. And more parties are using traditional business methods, not just to manage open source as a one-off issue, but in a continuous manner, seeking to improve processes and seek efficiency. And maturity modeling has been part of this aspect of business for a very long time. However, maturity modeling around managing open source is a topic that is perhaps underrepresented in reference material and in, well, public discourse. Now, recently, we've come across a few cases where capability maturity modeling of one type or another is beginning to include our ISO standards, especially the ISO standard for open source license compliance, 5230. And one of the leading pioneers in this field, actually, coincidentally, is on the line because it's Andrew, the chair of education. And we're quite fortunate then to be on the ground floor. As several parties around the world include our standard in maturity modeling, we're in a position to be very early in and provide community information, community ideas, and community resources on the topic. Now, before we get started, I'm going to show the antitrust policy notice. We show this at the beginning of every meeting of the OpenChain project, and it is intended to ensure that everyone knows how we can talk comfortably together. The full antitrust policy is on the Linux Foundation website. If you're from a member company, you can ask questions to our counsel, Andrew Updegrove. And of course, if you're not a Linux Foundation member company, you can address any questions to your own in-house or external legal advice providers. Right, enough of the formalities and the vague introductions I give, and it's time to hand it over to the professionals. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Excellent, Shane. Thank you very much indeed. My colleague Stephen is joining me. He's had a few connectivity issues, but I think he's sort of joining again shortly. So I'll just sort of start by an
I'm back in
introduction.
the room. Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, that's great to hear. So I have a couple of hats on at the moment. One of them, as Shane said, is that I'm the chair of the education work group. And one of the things that we've been doing in this year's session of the education work group is to introduce the materials that we've developed for capability maturity modeling, and we're using the resources of the excellent people who are members of the education work group to help develop those. And this arises because of a real client need, and we've had a number of clients who have, and this typically is sort of one sort of medium-sized client in particular, who implemented an open chain compliant program right at the beginning of the launch of the ISO. Um, but and that was working very well for them. But one individual within that organization then left, who was the champion behind the open chain program. And as a result, it means that there's nobody there at the moment who really understands the program in depth. So one of the things that we're aiming to do is to embed the open chain program more deeply within the processes of an organization to enable transition. It's not, it works very well if you implement it at the early stages, and the champion who has implemented it remains at the organization. But one example of what can happen is they can leave, or they can get moved to a different department, and that doesn't necessarily have the continuity that enables the program to continue. So that's one example of a live client situation that we have at the moment that we're trying to address. So what I will do is I will hand over to my colleague Stephen, who can explain a little bit more about the context behind this and what we're working on, and then I can talk you through the work that we've actually been doing in the education work group as far as documentation that we've produced. And I think Shane very helpfully also provides an Excel spreadsheet for those of you who have difficulty in accessing Google Docs. So Stephen, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. I will just put up a share. I think I'll stay off video because I've got quite an unstable network connection, so apologies for that. Right, let's go. Okay, so thanks very much, Shane, for organising this, and hello everybody. Good to see you all here today. As Andrew says, this is live ongoing work that we're doing through the education working group, picking up on a need that we're seeing in a number of different places. And what I will do this morning is talk through, well, what are the basics of a capability model? And Andrew gave a really good example of why organizations are using this, and there's a few others I'll sort of work through. And I will give you a view of the work that we've done so far, and I will also have a look then at well, can we move towards a baseline set, defining a shareable baseline definition of what capability measures and models are, so that organizations through the work of the education group can start sharing that information and working on this. And we're aiming towards trying to get to a timeline for the launch of the materials at OCS in Japan later this year. So that's what I'd like to talk about this morning. I'm very happy to take questions and comments as we go through. The the wider definition of what a capability maturity model is there, and it's really just something that allows you to take a snapshot at any point in time through an organization to answer this question as well: how good are we at doing something in particular? And it's a framework that allows a sort of like a consistent set of comparison and evaluation. So you'll be able to sort of identify how good one team is compared to another team, or one product line, or one part of the business compared to another. And I think one of the things we may be thinking about is that the name of this, we may be dropping the maturity question. I think we've seen a few I think some difficult experiences in the past with maturity models, because this is really we perhaps placing an emphasis on capability. This question of how good are we, and maturity in a way has some other connotations that people don't really like. But it's really just a simple question of saying, okay, how good are we? And these are the kind of contexts or situations that we have seen. And Andrew talked very much about the first one there, that organizations quite often go through a lot of work and a lot of effort to bed in, to implement certification with ISO, and having a compliant program for OpenChain. But over time, things can move, and the law of entropy quite often will be that things will erode, and things will work very differently and not necessarily be as successful. But also, organizations themselves are living, breathing, and making a lot of change all the time. There may be new product lines brought in who aren't then inducted into the necessary work and approach, or there could be a merger or an acquisition. A team could be bought, and again, there isn't that capability done. And so the capability model, some of the other things we've seen people do is they say, well, we want to be able to win the argument or build a business case for senior leadership, is to say, okay, well, yes, we did get compliance and certification. However, the recent trends or the changes, or we want to be able to explain, well, where we want to be able to improve our capabilities. So some clients will have looked at OpenChain and decided that certain aspects of the requirements are really key and really critical, and they need to do a lot of work on, and others are less key. They're compliant, but they may not need to be developed with full capabilities. And the capability model allows you to flex an understanding of, well, what do we need to focus on today for the next 12 months or for the next 24 months, 2 years. And the other thing that we've seen is this last one down here at the bottom. There may be a really key business milestone in the calendar coming up. There could be a merger, there could be another round of investment funding, and people want to have a really good, clear answer as to, do we have this question of managing our open source capabilities properly under control, and if we are subjected to any scrutiny, what can we see is in place, and talk to beyond the questions of certification. So these are some of the different uses that we reasons for looking at a capability model out there. And to move on, the work that we've been doing so far, we've picked up this question of, okay, well, if we want to be able to identify how good we are at something, then we do need to set a level of evaluation as to, well, what does compliant mean, and what does super performing mean. We have done some work on defining the capabilities that are implicit in ISO 5230, but not necessarily explicit. And so we've developed a map of capabilities, and I'll show that in a minute, which identifies the capabilities that you'd need to have in place to be compliant. Then there is an assessment method that has been road tested, and this approach has been shared and discussed. And in fact, I'm sure some of you have seen some of these conversations before, and that's all the feedback that we've had. We're taking into the way we're moving forward with the model. So the first piece is, well, what's inside the capability model, and the first question is this: well, okay, how do we define different levels of maturity? And then the next question is, well, what do we mean by a capability? And I think that the 4 boxes inside there of the 4 types of capability show the things that we're looking at. So if we are going to comply with ISO 5230, is it something that affects how people need to be given accountabilities? Is it something that affects the way in which governance needs to be set up? Is there a process that needs to be implemented and documented? Is there information required that goes with that process? And is there some tooling that needs to be in place to support that requirement of ISO 5230? So these are the 4 main elements that we're working with as a definition of a capability, and these are nice, tangible, practical things that you can then say to leadership in an organization. Okay, well, for us to be better at, let's say, introducing bill of materials, a decent SBOM, we do have the data in place, but we really need to get much better tooling in place, and we do need to make some accountability much clearer in the organization for and some training for the management of SBOMs. It would be, an example of how you might be able to build an argument for growing capability. So if we take a look then at the mapping work that's been done, you'll see here, and hopefully recognize, of course, the headings, the dark green boxes with the ISO requirement, the standard specification, reference numbers, all beginning with a 3. These are all the elements that come within ISO, and then underneath that, we've fleshed out in the lighter green boxes headline capability names, and for that we believe need to be implemented to achieve those requirement specifications. And in doing this work, we realized that there were sort of 3 different layers inside the ISO, even though it's not explicitly in the structure, but it gives you an idea of, well, what are the sort of strategic, the top layer there of the strategic or the governance things that we need to have in place. What's in a sort of middle layer of things that need to be in place that enable the organization and also perhaps measure how well we're doing. And then the open chain delivery layer we're calling there. This is the layer very much of, okay, well, what is the engine room of the processes that are involved in managing our obligations. The next slide there shows you the assessment questions that we've been road testing and using in a number of places, and those are being honed through that work. And these are the questions that then go behind the scenes if you wanted to, for example, assess how good you are against a particular requirement in the specification. And this one is the bill of materials example. And what and that material will be familiar to people. We've shared that before. But what we're moving on to now is what we're calling effectively a high-ish level baseline definition. So if we wanted to be able to explain to people or demonstrate to people what kind of things counts as a level 3 definition of capability for managing bill of materials compared to a level 5 definition for managing bill of materials, it would be really good to have a shared and agreed and sort of discussed baseline for what people expect to see in place. And that's something that's been drafted and being drafted, and the link has been shared. And what we're very much hoping is that through these calls, people will comment, contribute with us to that work with the other members of the education working group, so that this material can be published and produced, presumably with a guide or a how-to document explaining it, so that can then be shared and more widely understood, as to say, okay, here is a good starter view of what different levels of capability are across the specification. And that's something that I think we wanted to move on to next. And Andrew, were you going to pick that up?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just sort of talk you through what we're doing. So I'll see if I can share my screen. Right, so hopefully you can see this. Now, what we're doing here, we have to tread a fairly careful line, because as you all know, the idea of open chain is that it's not prescriptive. So you know, it provides a framework, and so it explains in sort of broad terms, you know, what needs to be done and what the outcomes need to be. But it does not say this is the way that you need to do it. But that does make it more difficult, because it's very to understand, because it is very, very abstract. And clearly, if you're trying to explain to people what you're trying to achieve in terms of an open chain conformant program, it's helpful to have specific examples and to be able to say, well, a company does X, Y, and Z, and that may involve, you know, specifics such as they use certain tooling, for example. So what I just want to stress here is that the document that I'm about to walk through, and I'm going to do this very quickly. I'm not going to go into great depth here, but you know, it may say that a company specifically does X, Y, Z, and in many ways that's useful as an illustration to show that if they're doing this, then when they will reach a certain level of maturity. But what it doesn't say is that you must do exactly this to reach that level of maturity. And in fact, as the model develops, you know, we might have sort of you know, a few examples of how that level of maturity can be reached. So an example there would be, I mean, I think we're probably agreed now that given the scope and the size of most software development, which includes open source components, that it's going to be very difficult to do this in practice without tooling. Now, some organizations might choose to use proprietary tooling, some organizations might choose to use open source tooling, or indeed some organizations might choose to take a role their own approach as far as sort of scanning, etc., is concerned. You know, and from an open chain perspective, each of those is equally valid. So, you know, before I dive into this, I just want to say that if we do put specific examples in here, and it says, you know, this organization is using a proprietary solution for doing this, that doesn't mean that we, or indeed the Open Chain project, is endorsing that proprietary solution. It's just saying this is one particular option way of attaining the goal. So I'll walk you through this very quickly. And as we talk, it occurs to me that it might be helpful to actually find a platform that is more widely accessible. At the moment, we're using Google Sheets, but I'll sort of work on this in the background. Shane has very helpfully shared the Excel version of this, but you know, we'd like to make this collaborative development, and we've already had really good input from people as part of the education work group to improve this document. And clearly, the more people that can do that, you know, from our perspective, the better. So let me talk you through this. Now, hopefully you can see my pointer here. So this first column here is the text of ISO 5230, the Open Chain specification. And what I've done here is I have highlighted in green all of the rows that represent the verification materials. So these are the actual requirements that if somebody is coming in to assess or audit your Open Chain conformant program, then these are the criteria which they will be considering to do that. And then against each of those, then you'll see that I've put in a section of columns here, and these correspond with the set of levels that Stephen was talking about just now. With one slight change, I'll explain that to you. So you will recall that the levels of maturity are initial, repeatable, defined and implemented, managed and optimizing. And you'll also have spotted that I have put in here an additional level, which is purely defined. So these correspond with maturity level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and purely defined is level 2.5. And the reason that we've put that in is that if you are obtaining level 2.5, then you've defined your open chain compliance program, but you're not necessarily operating it yet. And if you're doing that, then you're able to self-certify that you have an open chain compliance program in place, but you're not able to demonstrate that it actually works because you haven't used it yet. So a basic level of assessment will be at level 2.5, and also, yes, you have all of the characteristics of an open chain conformant program in place, but it's not until you get to level 3 and above that you're able to have a formal audit, because in order to have a formal audit, you'll need to be able to demonstrate that you've been operating the program and it actually works. So so I'll give you a sort of an example. Now, this, as I say, is a work in progress. So there's a load of text in here, but there should be text in each of these green boxes. But you will see that we haven't completed some of these boxes, and this is really the work that we're looking for the educational work group to help us with, and also anyone else who wants to get involved. We'd be sort of absolutely delighted if they would help us. So this is just to give a real concrete example of where we think you would be if your organization fulfills these criteria. So I'll just give you one example starting at the beginning here. So an initial level, so you'll recall that the requirement in the specification is to have a documented list of roles with corresponding responsibilities for the different participants in the program. So the first level of compliance would be, well, staff are allocated open source compliance roles on an ad hoc basis. Okay, that doesn't fulfill the open chain requirements, but it does mean that the organization is on a journey towards open source compliance. The next stage is if a company starts thinking about this and they've got a high level list of roles and you've got staff who are allocated to those roles. So there's an awareness of what the roles are. There's an awareness that staff have to be allocated to the roles. But again, it's fairly ad hoc. There's no specific process for doing that. And again, that would not be compliant with open chain, but it shows that an organization is one step further along that journey. And then we would get to define. So this is the point at which an organization can say, yes, we have an open chain compliant set of practices and procedures in place, but we haven't necessarily started operating yet. And so then we would have a defined list of roles, and the staff would be allocated to those particular roles, and the relevant competencies would also be taken into account. So at that point, it would be possible to say yes, we have everything in place. We haven't started operating yet, and then we get to the sort of implementation level, and this is when staff have actually been taken into the relevant roles, and they're actually doing their work, and then with managed. Then there is a formal management process to enable to ensure that those roles are being fulfilled appropriately. But there's not necessarily a formal set of metrics to do that. And then the final and highest level is when you have optimizing, is when the whole of the process is defined and you have metrics in place to make sure that things are happening appropriately. Those metrics are reviewed on a regular basis, and then action is taken based on what the metrics are. So if there are particular issues with one particular role is not being fulfilled properly, then you can monitor that because you have some metrics in place to do that, and then you can put into place some sort of activity to ensure that that's improved. So I'm not going to go through this in any greater detail at the moment. Obviously, anyone is welcome to raise any questions now if you would like me to do that. And this is something that we're going to be and have already been examining more closely as far as the education work group is concerned. But we're already finding that this approach is quite useful to explain to clients what their current situation is and what their journey might be. And it's also important to realize that they may not want to be heading for a level 5 against all categories. It's not necessary for their business needs to do that. I mean, for larger organizations, it typically will be, but for smaller organizations, they might say that a more informal approach actually works very well for us, and that our management processes are sufficient to enable us to incorporate a mechanism of continuous improvement, which is essentially what we're aiming for here. So as you can see, we've fulfilled. We've filled out a few more of the boxes here. There's still a fair amount of work to do. We've had good feedback from people in the education work group. I think people are sort of actively involved in this, and they're telling us that this is going to be useful. And what we're aiming to do is to be able to present a fully populated version of this at the Open Compliance Summit at the end of October. And that also would provide a great forum for anyone to come to us with any sort of suggestions or improvements there as well. So no, that's great. That's sort of all I needed to sort of mention at the moment. If anyone has any questions about that, either sort of pop them in the chat, or Stephen, sort of back over to you.
Go for it, yeah. Go.
Yeah, thank you. So Sasha here from Deloitte. Andrew, one question. So first of all, it's a really good capability model, so it's going in a very, very good direction. One question: have you thought about bringing in some numbers and figures as KPIs, so that customers have to reach a specific number of percentage on some indications, because it's easy to measure for customers, easier to understand
Yes.
sometimes, to think in figures. Have you thought in this direction?
Yes, I think Stephen, over to you, because you've been sort of
Yeah.
leading the work that we've been doing on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sasha. That's a great question. Yes. So the work that I showed, which had questions which are linked to each of the different capabilities, you can then give yourself a score, and we've looked at a number of different weightings and the way in which you can effectively say, yep, you are 65% towards level 4 or something like that in a particular capability. That's exactly what we're doing. I think for the purposes of the OpenChain project and the OpenChain education working group, I think we will probably wait until the sort of like the baseline piece has been distributed and understood before we move on to this idea of having some absolute scoring, because I think there's an evolution, and Shane, you may want to comment on this. As ISO 5230 becomes much more widely adopted and in place, then people will be more ready to sort of have some metrics and scores which are then effectively set as absolutes. Whereas at this stage in the project history, it's a really good way to be open and readily and easily implementable. And we don't want the idea of well, if you don't get a score of this or that and against 158 different measures, that may not be the best way to grow understanding and adoption. So yes, I think in time that will come. That would be my view.
Absolutely. Oh, sorry, Stephen.
No, that would go for it, Shane. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and to concur with you about the market evolution. That in the earlier days, the key thing was for people to have any compliance processes in place, and then we gradually, with the OpenChain project and the ISO standard, identified the process points people need. And as the market matures, people are saying, okay, so not just the existence of the process point and how we filled it out today, where do we go next? And that type of evolution of the market, this idea of continual improvement, continual refinement, is seen in every aspect of our ecosystem. So organizations are doing more third-party certification than before. They might self-certify and then think, and how do we iterate on this? How do we improve this? Well, let's bring in a third party and have that third-party certification. So I think the maturity modeling fits into this concept of Kaizen, of continual improvement. And you could say that the very basic adoption of ISO 5230 is a really good floor. Even if you have the simplest way of filling out the process points, you'll cover the key process points where failures tend to occur. So the floor for good license compliance is the letter of the license, and you put some stuff in there. The letter of the standard, I apologize, the letter of the standard, and you put some processes in where it says you need them. But that floor can and will be improved, whether to save time, to save money, to deal with errors that the existing process content cannot manage, etc., etc. And that's why the maturity modeling fits, very neatly into that. And I suppose the biggest and most exciting thing for me is the idea that this maturity modeling discussion is about giving everyone in the world access to an overview when they ask, how do we continually improve? How do we iterate? How do we measure this? This is a framework to do so. And I also, Sasha, really think you touched on an important point. What type of KPIs can we help people find? How do we help people, if they so wish, to get the metrics they need? And of course, at the same time, we need to be sensitive to the fact that, and I think Andrew alluded to this very elegantly, some companies just won't want this. They'll get to a point and say, this is where we're at. We're not going to continue iterating. What we have is good enough for our problem space. Some companies will self-certify and never do third-party certification. Some companies will have a single implementation of the ISO 5230 process points and choose not to iterate, not to evolve those processes because what they have works. That's valid too. So anyway, we're responding to a market need. It makes sense. It fits into business approaches that pre-exist. And the question then for us is, as reference material, how do we make this simple, non-prescriptive, and accessible? And I think this call is a very good starting point to give people that type of content. And, you know, I just mentioned in the chat a question. There was a great talk at the Open Compliance Summit in Tokyo last December about this, introducing it. So we've got a slide deck about this. We've got this recording, which will be published later alongside the slide deck, and of course the document work in progress. And yeah, great work, guys. This is looking very nice. Sorry, Stephen, that was a lengthier interjection than I expected. I will be quiet now.
No, thank you, Shane. It's great. It's great to have that view of how the market is evolving. Does anyone have any kind of opinions on the naming? Because sometimes the name can be really, really important in terms of the purpose. Is there any views on prior history or track records of other capability maturity models versus something which I think you picked up on there, Shane, which is this view of what does continually improving look like as it, you know, or something Kaizen? Is there a view? Do people have a sense?
Maybe I would just suggest to make it quite easy to understand from the naming. So maybe capability maturity model, maybe it can just strip down to the open source compliance management maturity model or something. So that's easier to understand, or easy to understand what is given there. So
yeah,
yeah. So that would be just
thanks, Sasha.
yeah,
helpful. Thank you.
Maybe just another opinion, but I would like to dig into the file if you don't mind afterwards.
please do.
And Andrew, you have described the maturity level 2.5 in the middle, which is some kind of an in-between state. Even with the explanation, it was quite hard to understand what it's actually for, and maybe it's not necessary in the end. So especially if you're saying the next level of 3 is that you are required to have for an audit.
Yes.
Maybe it does not need an in-between state actually, because that's already describing the level 3 then that you are capable to run it now. So I did not get why it needs this in-between state.
Yes, I mean the thinking here, and again, you know, input from sort of people with sort of more specific audit experience is sort of really helpful. Is that with MM3, you know, the idea that it has been implemented, and that therefore there are some metrics which you can already apply, whereas MM 2.5 really just states that all of the practices and procedures are in place. You know, some of them may have been implemented, but the whole process hasn't been implemented. And I think this sort of historically goes back to the early days of the open chain specification, where it was possible for somebody to put all the practices and procedures in place and self-certify that they'd put all these practices and procedures in place, but this would enable them to have self-certification from day one. They wouldn't have to wait for a year or whatever to look back over what had been happening to be able to say, well, we did this and it actually worked. So I think that was the and remains the rationale between for having this sort of level 2.5. I agree it's not ideal because it doesn't sort of map onto the sort of the classic 5 levels of maturity, but it seemed to me to be the sort of neatest way to express that.
Mm-hmm. Would you think that it's possible to match it to either the maturity level 2 or 3? Would you think that's possible to get this in there? So this kind of in between state, and just move it either to the left or right direction.
Yes, I suppose I would have to give that some thought. I mean, I have, and we've sort of discussed this to a certain extent already. I think moving it left to repeatable is problematic, because there are plenty of situations where we've come across clients who are basically at a level 2, who are actually pretty good at open source compliance, but they haven't sort of defined and codified what they're doing. You know, it's like the UK Constitution. It's written down, but it's in all sorts of places, and it's not. So, in order to sort of codify what you're doing, then you would have to move on to the defined level, and then you would be at 2.5. If we move 2.5 to the right and say defined and implemented, then I think it's going to make it more difficult for people to be able to self-certify, because I mean, what I really wanted to make sure is the level in here that was compatible with the way that the self-certification system currently works, and that in my view is 2.5. I don't know if Shane, if you've got any thoughts about that. But I agree, it is not ideal to have this sort of halfway step.
You know, I think I think we're at something where we're dealing with the way the existing standard exists, the way it was put together, and it's not a perfect fit for what we're doing here. So there will be a few rough edges like this. Ultimately, I think it doesn't matter too much if we move it somewhere or other. I mean, let me just give you an example. And here I'm putting on my political scientist hat, which has nothing to do with compliance or law, but it would feel great to people if it was shifted over to 3 and then they'd score a point there. And whether it's
Yeah.
at 2 or 2.5 or 3, I think won't matter so much. What might be useful though is when we find something like this that's a bit of a rough edge due to how our standard works and so on, that we feed that back into future versions of the standard itself. You know,
Yeah.
it's a feedback loop. But yeah,
It is very much so. Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess my thinking was that the way that the standard was presented initially, and Shane, as you very cogently said earlier, it was a sort of a relatively low bar. It was intended to try to make it easy for organisations to probably define a processes that, to be honest, most decent organisations would actually be doing already. And that once they'd reached that level, then they would immediately be able to self-certify that they had all of these procedures in place. And once they'd done that, even if they hadn't implemented it yet, they would be in a pretty good place as far as overall compliance is concerned. So what I'm slightly wary of, and it's great we're having this conversation, is to say there has to have been a degree of implementation already, because then that's sort of also saying, okay, at that point, we're going to have to raise the bar a bit as far as self-certification is concerned to show, and and I've been in various meetings where there have been discussions around that. So it's so that's a sort of a slight concern. But I think I agree with the sentiment that if we can deal with 2.5 in some way and get rid of it, that would be sort of very, very helpful. Organizations have sort of talked about sort of open chain readiness, and essentially what they mean by open chain readiness is that, yes, they do have everything defined, and it's all in place, but they haven't necessarily implemented it yet. Those are the sort of factors that I'm sort of considering when we're discussing this.
And it's a
Yeah,
very good point. Oh, sorry, just to chime in and echo that self-certification can and must be an easy bar for people to cross. Some companies in a sophisticated manner, like when BlackBerry or ARM did it. Some companies, a tiny small enterprise in the deep part of the supply chain, must be able to pick up our standard and self-certify quickly to plug the keyholes in process management on compliance. So whatever we do, just to concur with Andrew, should aim to support rather than challenge that ability at all times.
Yeah. If I can just add to that too, I think it all adds to this, intention for this kind of work to just make sure it's really relevant to what people in the market need, as opposed to an academic exercise of implementing a set of measures. And so, I'd be really interested to hear from people if there are particular use cases which really sort of come to mind, so that we could, give an illustration. I don't know, for example, just the question of how to really properly manage bill of materials, or how people are thinking about the impact of elements of AI that are beginning to appear with open source like characteristics. How they're implemented. We could use this capability model to showcase a sort of a heat map. These are the parts of the capabilities that really come into play for a particular business question or a particular technology question. I think that's another direction that we could take things.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously that's something that the Open Chain project is sort of looking at in I think the new SBOM work group and the AI discussion group as well.
Yeah, no, exactly. And we could produce a complementary, when the time is right, we could produce a complementary sort of heat map that says, okay, this is where the guide maps into the model.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually that sort of also introduces another point, which is, at the moment we're concentrating on ISO 52230. But clearly, if this model works well for that, and we hope that it will, then we also want to introduce it for the other aspects of compliance, such as security and vulnerabilities, etc., that OpenChain also focuses on.
I must say, I'm very excited, Sasha, to have you leaning into this as well. It's tremendous to have you on board. And, we're kicking this off sort of just before everyone vanishes for summer vacation. But this is also purposeful, because the 30th and 31st of October is when we'll have this Open Compliance Summit in Japan. And if we can bring the first iteration of this material to that event, we'll make a substantial contribution. And that will be also exposing us to a pretty broad international audience, especially key participants from the Asian supply chain.
Absolutely. So just as far as sort of next steps are concerned, we will be holding a meeting of the education work group in August. So it's on Wednesday the 7th. Unfortunately, it's not ideally timed for our Asian participants because it will be at 5 o'clock UK time. But we are going to be holding that at the law firm that I'm working with, Bristos LLP, in London, as well as virtual online. So if people want to participate in person, it will be absolutely fantastic to see them, and we hope to be able to sort of workshop through some of this then as well. But the work will sort of continue to be going on in the background on the mailing list, etc. also.
And with regards, what we can expect this week, I'm going to be taking this call recording as soon as it's available tomorrow, preparing it, releasing it with the slides, link to the spreadsheet, and a downloadable Excel version of the spreadsheet as well, encouraging people to go to the education mailing list for further activity. So, and of course, the next call on 7th of August. So I'll be basically starting this promotion, and then throughout actually the next 2 months, our social media will continually refer to this and the fact that we're aiming to have an end product, a first version at the end of October.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you very much, Shane. Stephen, is there anything you wanted to wind up with? I think we're reaching the natural conclusion of what we needed to say.
No, thank you.
Jari.
Just a thanks.
Yeah, fantastic.
Just a question from my side, like how, because now we have like quite a lot of these empty boxes still there, the green boxes. What's the plan to start to get those filled in, from everybody? Like, how do you
are we going to edit directly the document in a Google Docs, or what's the plan?
Yeah, that's one approach. I mean, one I'm planning on doing at the next education workgroup meeting is actually just to sort of workshop some of it live and see how well that works. I mean, I've had some suggestions come through on email, and we've incorporated those as well. So it seems that that's a good way to do it. As I say, it does occur to me that Google Docs might not be the perfect platform for this. I mean, one possibility is that we have an xCloud instance, which we could allow people access to instead, and I think that's going to be more globally accessible.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's something that will work within the background.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that. I think we really want to balance pace with wider conversation and contribution,
Exactly.
and so we get so much from those sessions when people do join like this, and so we'll do some live working on a shared document, but also of course always really happy for comments to come into a document. So we'll get that really clear, and perhaps send around a timetable and some where is it and how and when do we suggest people contribute.
Exactly.
Perfect.
And if we have sort of feedback that people want to have a live workshop session that's also better timed for Asia as well, we'd be very happy to do that. That's another option. Fantastic.
Brilliant.
Good. Well, thank you so much, Shane, for arranging this. It's been great. We've had some fantastic feedback. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending as well. Stephen and I are always available to answer any questions that you might have. So you can track us down easily enough. But we're excited by the direction that this is going in. So we're getting some really good client feedback. It's already sort of proving to be sort of very useful for a number of organisations. So to sort of final plug for the education work group, we're doing a bunch of other stuff in there as well, producing some really good explainer videos. So Martin Miyagi's been doing a lot of work on that. That's really good. We're also producing some small explainer documents, which are useful to be able to explain to different business units within an organization what OpenChain is all about. So it's sort of tailored to their needs. And these just sort of basically set of 3 or 4 slides aimed at, for example, the C-suite, or aimed at research and development, aimed at marketing and so on, which address why OpenChain is good for them as far as their business unit is concerned. We've got a big roster of activities going on in the education work group. So feel free to drop in either on the mailing list or as I say, in the meetings, either virtually or, as far as the next one is concerned anyway, in person as well. Great to see you. So thanks again, everyone.
Brilliant. Have a lovely day. Take care. Stay healthy. Stay
Absolutely.
well. Thanks again.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Okay.
Thank you. Great work. Thank you.
Bye-bye.